Hi, Kerry here again. Welcome to my video, my channel, what have you. It's been over a week since I did my last video, so I just wanted to catch up and maybe delve into something a little different away from books per se. First of all, I am currently reading A Sound Mind by Paul Morley. It's not working out quite what the advertising and the cover lines kind of indicate the book is. I won't say I'm not enjoying it, but it's not quite what I was expecting, and it's become a bit of a trudge going through the book. I'm about halfway through, so I should finish it within the next week, so I'll have more to talk about that one a bit later. Now, really what I wanted to talk about today was the things that are keeping me from reading. In this modern life, I seem to be nagged persistently in my head by you're not reading this because of X and Y, and the two things which really seem to grab my free time when I'm not reading books are podcasts and magazines. Now, they may have a few things in common there, but the big thing in common I think that attracts me is podcasts and magazines are both little bits of concentrated subjects that I'm interested in, produced by people who are interested in the same things as me. So that attracts me, and I seem to suffer from creating rods for my own back with these things. I have something like 100 podcasts subscribed to in my podcast program. I'm still using iTunes on Windows. Yes, I am that one guy who probably is still. And I'm finding it really hard to get through listening to all the podcasts. They start to back up, and lately I've had to do a bit of a triage, unsubscribe from a whole bunch of them and just not listen to a lot more. So that's a first world problem. Now, magazines and me go back a long way. As a small child, my father used to get paid on Wednesdays, and he'd come home with a big newspaper, as they were used in those days, newspapers filled with fish and chips, and you'd have magazines and a comic perhaps for me in the earlier days, and later on a part work, maybe on something on military technology or aircraft, the things that interested me. And the magazine they had a standing order for was the New Zealand Listener. Now, the Listener is a magazine that's been around since the 1930s. As the name suggests, it was originally full of radio listings for the few stations that operated in New Zealand back then. And it was a big old thing back in those days. It's about twice or more the size of its current incarnation, and it was printed on a fairly cheap newsprint. But I used to be the first one in the house that got to read it, and I'd put it on the floor, flick through it, and I saw lots of wonderful things in it. It was like the first time I saw anything about the movie Star Wars coming was in the Listener. And also there's lots of interesting advertising for other magazines and other books. Back in those days, publishers used to print, half-page adverts for books that were coming out. And I remember seeing adverts for things like Stephen King's The Stand and John Steakley's Armour and all sorts of things. And a lot of this went into my head, and when I was older, and I would seek out these things that I saw as a child. Now, magazines continue to be a thing of fascination for me. Later on in the 80s and 90s, whenever I'd visit the central city or one of the suburban malls, I'd visit a bookstore, and more often than not, I'd come home with a magazine which interested me, from aviation magazines such as the late great Air International and the 410 Times in the 90s. And also around that time, I'd go to the library, and the library would have a lot of magazines that you could either read in the library or check out the older ones. And that's where I first discovered Flight International. And that was a bit of a passion for me, that magazine. It came to cover all the things I was interested in, and even though it was months behind the time, by the time they arrived in our shores and in the library, I would occasionally buy it in the shops as well. Now, fast forward to today, and I'm still a subscriber to quite a few magazines. a lot of the same ones that I used to buy and look at as a kid or see advertised in other magazines, and subscriptions were a out of reach thing for me back in those days. It's just with the event of the internet, it's becoming within my grasp, and I have signed up for quite a few magazines over the years. A few of them have failed and burnt out, and a few these days are shadows of their former selves in content and format. But let me just go through a few that I'm still getting. Right, weekly magazine that I still get is the New Zealand Listener. The one I mentioned before. It's been around since the 30s. It ran right through till about April last year. We know its publisher, Bauer Media, which had taken it over in the a few years earlier, had basically shut down all its New Zealand operation. The Listener stopped publishing for its first time in about 80 odd years. But fortunately it was taken over by another company, an Australian company, and they've decided to republish a whole swathe of magazines that used to be popular, and the Listener was saved. It came back in the towards the later part of 2020, around September, October, it started coming back, and my subscription restarted then. So that was some good news. Now, Listener is a bit of an all things for all person magazine. As I said earlier, its original rationale was to provide news and listings for radio programs. And when television came in the 1960s, it was the only place you could find listings for the state-owned television channels. And strangely enough, it stayed that way until the 1980s. The Listener was actually partly run by the government, and it didn't become privately owned until the 1990s. These days you still get television listings in it, like so, but it's also one of the leading magazines for covering the arts, entertainment, literature, and of course it does have large feature items on current events. And I don't use the TV listings in it too much. I just scan through them quickly to see if there's anything big coming up in the week. I'm watching less and less normal broadcast TV these days. It seems just for news and filling in the gaps between streaming channels and streaming services. So I'm not sure what the future holds for these type of magazines. I think the current events and the feature articles and the books articles, etc. we'll see it through. It's apparently very popular still, so that's the Listener. And at the other end of into enthusiasm corner here is the Aviation Historian. Now, I discovered this magazine in another magazine. That was the British Interplanetary Society Spaceflight magazine. Used to come with membership to the society. I've let that lapse lately. The magazine wasn't really doing much for me, and I didn't see much more benefits to being a member. Might pick it up again. I understand that they've changed the magazine so it only covers present and future space technology now. It used to be full of retrospectives on Apollo and Gemini and what have you, and to the point of becoming boring, and it used to use the same old stock photos and whatever, and then they'd fill a couple of pages as someone's article like, I visited a site where a missile was launched in World War II, and here's a lump of iron on the ground. And like I said, they've changed focus lately, so I may pick it up again, but right now, due to financial issues, I'm not running to renew my subscription. But as I was talking about, the Aviation Historian, this is a wonderful little magazine. It's small digest form, and it basically covers what it says, historical articles about aviation and aviators, and covers a wide variety of military and civil, and it's a good value if you're into that type of thing. Unfortunately, I'm a few issues behind in actually reading it. Like I said, these magazines, podcasts are eating up my spare time, and when I'd rather be actually reading books. So it's a matter of having a quick look here and there, and then putting it away and hoping that I remember which issue had something amazing that I wanted to read. So at the other end of the enthusiast spectrum is Smithsonian Air and Space, or Air and Space Smithsonian, published by the Smithsonian Institute in the United States. It's a kind of a more general air and space, as it says, magazine. It usually has a few feature articles in each issue and a whole lot of regular columns and sidebars and what have you. I see that it's more of a general read, but it's still for the enthusiast, and I always find something interesting in each issue, even if it's just the fantastic photography that they use. Now, I'm about a couple of magazines behind and actually reading this one too. I'm not sure what's happened to my subscription to it. It seems to be going on, but with the mail system as it is in these COVID days, sometimes you just don't see another issue for months and months, and you wonder what's happened to it. Right. Now, the other magazines which I'm currently reading are all residing on my iPad these days. And most of those have been my choice. I started switching over to digital only about 2 years ago with some magazines. Just the price was much better and the convenience was much better. I was getting piles of magazines every year that I was having to find storage space for. At one point I was taking them to my employer in the break room, but that changed when I changed jobs. So, magazines, here we go. Let's see, what have we got there? We've got Empire magazine. Now that's a British movie and TV and a little bit of video games, a little bit of this and that. It's usually the one to break news in the movie industry, new projects coming up, new TV projects coming up, who's starring and what. And it has a lot of background information about classic movies and the making of films and TV. In these COVID days when cinemas are being shut, they seem to be delving back into the archive and branching out into different things. A recent issue was published with the Edgar Wright as an editor, and he got all his movie mates to write about their experiences in cinema and what really moved them and etc. like that. This latest issue looks back a bit to 2001 and when The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter films first came out. And along with the feature articles, there are regular departments in that as well that look at current movies and what have you. I used to subscribe to the actual physical paper copy of that magazine, but I couldn't really justify the price, and a few years later I went back with it on the iPad. So that's Empire. Wired magazine. Now, that was a big name in the 1990s. I was attracted to it back then, and for the first 3 or 4 years I bought it religiously. It was like the magazine for the technology, internet that was blowing up at that time. Unfortunately, it started to believe its own hype, and there's countless articles about how the internet and technology were going to save our world and solve all trouble and issues. So I let it go after a few years, and then about 7 or 8 years ago there was some deal going online where you could get the magazine sent you again for $5 a year or something. So I signed up with that, and I found that the feature articles had improved a lot. It was a lot slimmer, there was less advertising these days, but what was there was quite excellent. So I kept that up, and then when I got an option to renew, I changed it to the digital edition, and I've had that for about 2 or 3 years now. And the only thing that's bothered me about it lately is that it seems to be easing off the big feature articles. Last issue was entirely excerpts from a novel about a war with China, and I didn't even bother reading the whole thing, so I'm a little worried about that magazine. Wired, it's now owned by Condé Nast, and I've got a feeling that they may not support the magazine for much longer. So what else have we got here? Jane's Defence Weekly. Now, I had a complimentary subscription to that magazine. I'm not sure, I think I just applied for it online and they approved it. I used to read this in the library, and it was an excellent publication back then, full of photographs and information about weapons, arms and armour, all that type of thing. It's changed owners several times over the years, and I got a chance to get a complimentary subscription, and that ran for about a year or so, and then they said, we're switching that to a digital one, and then they said that the digital one would end after a certain time, and strangely enough they keep telling me that it's ended, but I keep getting it on my iPad, and they keep giving me access to it, so I don't know what's going on there. Hopefully they don't give me a big bill for the last couple of years. And here's a SFX, that's still loading. Now this is a science fiction, fantasy, movie, media, TV, video game, book, comic, whatever, magazine that's from the UK. I used to see it occasionally in the shops and buy maybe 1 or 2 issues in the 90s and early 2000s. There it goes, it's loaded. It's pretty good for what it shows. It's not quite the groundbreaking magazine layout and design that it used to be. It still covers movies and TV, but most of the news these days you see online first, so the magazine's a little slow off the mark, being a monthly only publication. Now I've recently renewed this. I get it online only now, and it's an interesting diversion. Like other British magazines such as Empire, it has that kind of irreverent, jokey tone in a lot of the articles and picture captions. I quite enjoy that. You can trace that back really to the computer and video game magazines of the late 80s and 90s. Well, I used to buy one called Amiga Format because I was a big Amiga computer user, and that general tone and you know, fun tone and style that really appeals to me in magazines. A lot of the other magazines you get from like the United States are very po-faced, very self-important, and so that's SFX. And here's another one, 410 times. Now I used to buy this occasionally from the shops when I was visiting town or what have you, and when I got a regular job, I signed up for a subscription, a physical subscription, and in theory I still have a physical subscription, but in the since COVID the deliveries have become so erratic that they gave me a free digital subscription as well. So 14 times, it's for those of us interested in the fringe topics, all sorts of things, ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, to name a few. Lots of little sidebars and columns and what have you, as well as feature articles. I don't take that type of thing too seriously, as I've said before, but that type of fringe, on the edge type stuff does appeal to me as an entertainment or an escape. Over the years, you see the same things being recycled again as a new generation comes along, and you just sigh a little about that. But yeah, it's a good magazine. It's certainly different, and likewise, it does have that kind of UK jokey side to it as well. Okay, next up, 2000 AD. This is the only comic I subscribe to. I used to buy the physical edition at something like 15 cents a copy from the local shop when I was about 10 years old. I bought it religiously for about 5 or 6 years and saw all the golden age 2000 AD things like Judge Dredd and the Apocalypse War, Nemesis Book 1 to about Book 3, and you know, a lot of the well-known comic characters that 2000 AD created. Like a lot of magazines, it's kind of suffered over the years. It went a bit of a bad patch through the 90s and I stopped reading it. I haven't actually seen a physical copy for probably 20 years. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, I started reading it again online, and I've had a subscription running for about the last 3 years. It's okay. Doesn't really match its glory days. They kind of aim low these days. In fact, the latest edition is what they call regened issue, where they aim it at younger readers. They're trying to capture a younger reader because of their ordinary reader these days seems to be a man in the 40s and 50s, and I think that they don't see much of a future in that readership. Okay. So the only other magazine that I can think of that I still also subscribe to, and that's a fairly recent one, is New Zealand Geographic. It's quite an excellent magazine. once you sign up for an all-access subscription, you can read all its articles online, and they still send you the paper magazine. I don't have a copy at hand, but the last one had an article about cats, and there was a cat on the cover, and it usually has 2 or 3 in-depth articles and a whole lot of little columns and what have you, and it's about nature and science and geography and maps and archaeology in New Zealand. So it's an excellent magazine, and I think it's something like 80 New Zealand dollars a year for the full-up subscription. Okay, I hope that didn't bore you all to death. So that was about the last magazine that I'm going to talk about. So I hope you're having a good day, and hope you enjoyed the video. So we'll see you again soon.